How's it going, guys? My name is Zach with the Movie Castle, and today we're going to be talking about Tales from the Darkside. This is Season 2, Episode 3, and this one's entitled Ring Around the Redhead. This is from October 13th, 1985, and is directed by Ted Gershuny. This episode stars John Hurd, Penelope Miller, and Caris Corfman. The teleplay for this episode was written by the director, Ted Gershuny, but based on a story by John D. MacDonald. In this episode, a scientist is in his lab when an earthquake accidentally opens up this ring, a portal, hence the Ring Around the Redhead title, and after experimenting it for a little while, he accidentally pulls a beautiful woman out of the portal, and the two start to learn about each other's worlds. He starts to teach her how to speak and read his language, and she starts to tell him about all the advanced science from her world. And the two form an interesting relationship. However, we know that it's not going to pan out 100% perfect. You see, this story is told through a framing mechanism where in the future we see the guy's in prison. He's on death row, and people are telling him, the girl was never real, you're crazy, and you're responsible for this guy's death. So someone's going to die and the girl's going to disappear. No one's going to believe him and he's going to wind up on death row. And he's telling this story to a reporter, one of the last few people who wants to hear what he has to say. So an interesting, blossoming sci-fi romance. But we know that it's going to end in some strange and terrible way. A pretty interesting setup. Overall, I thought this was a really fun, it's kind of a pulpy, classic sci-fi tale, It reminds me of something that you could have read in an old-timey science fiction magazine or comic book. It really does have that classic feel to it, and granted how this says based on a story by, I'm willing to bet that they did pull this out of an old sci-fi, literature magazine or something. But a pretty interesting story, really a classic feel, and I realized, it is kind of the trope, finding the beautiful woman from another dimension. You think that'd be incredibly specific, but you see it all the time, the strange, beautiful woman. At first you can't talk to her, and then you realize she has these amazing, spectacular powers. There's a few moments toward the beginning of this that it did feel a little bit like, Lilu from The Fifth Element, So yeah, lots of classic sci-fi stuff going on here, and a good bit of, retro pulp here. So I thought that was definitely pretty fun. A really cool and interesting relationship. The whole, on my world we do this, what do they do on your world, Fun stuff like that. However, definitely some faults here, and another case of Darkside's budgetary problem. This is a cool episode, but the budget does hold it back in a few ways. For example, the portal itself, he acts like, oh, I'm seeing all this crazy stuff, but as an audience, we don't get to see, like, the inside of the portal. We don't get to peer in and see all these crazy worlds, So the portal is a little underutilized and underplayed, and even a little bit underexplained. You don't really know where it came from, or what all it can do, or how to control it, And I really wish we had the budget to explore the portal more and figure out the ins and outs of it and how it works and see all these other crazy aspects of it. But yeah, the budget kinda underplays the portal, so they do have to focus on the relationship, because the sci-fi element, you can't really go too hard into it. But another thing too, also dealing with the budget, is the last act of this episode. There's some big crazy stuff that happens, and of course Darkside doesn't have the budget for it, so towards the end we'll spend a little bit too much time in the framing mechanism, And in the framing mechanism, the guy can just tell us what happened, which saves a ton of money. He can say, oh, this big crazy thing happened, and they can film him saying that, but yeah, you definitely don't have the budget to actually show this. So having large chunks of the third act take place in the framing mechanism and only being told what happens, that is a bit of a letdown, but I totally see why they had to do it that way. But yeah, so the end gets a little messed up because they can't show everything. They did find a way to tell it, but yeah. But that being said, I won't spoil the very end. But the very end does end on a pretty fun visual element, and I can only imagine what everyone in the room seeing that would have thought. It does have a pretty cool end in, but, you know, before that, the other stuff in the final act sadly did have to get glossed over, but it does lead to an interesting place, and the relationship, that's what matters, and they did do that pretty well. So yeah, it's good. They got the relationship, and I suppose that is what matters, but yeah, some of the sci-fi elements are a little bit played down, and I guess we'll get more into that in a little bit. Without further ado, I want to go ahead and jump into the story. I'm not going to be doing any major spoilers, but I do want to say my piece on a few plot points and make sure you guys have a basic understanding as to what this episode's about. So let's go ahead and dive right in. I'll just be avoiding the end. We open up with this prisoner, your main character, who's going to be executed in 6 hours, so not got much time left, and a reporter's there with him. The reporter is skeptical. She's heard the gist of the story before and thinks he's just a crazy person, and we hear little hints of the plot to come. We hear things like, she was never real, she was all in your head, and you have to admit you killed that guy, right? So we don't know who she is yet, and we don't know who's going to die, but we know that he's in a bad place, and no one believes him. But luckily for the guy, the girl's boss, her editor, seems to think there's something there. I don't know if he legitimately believes this guy or just thinks there's an interesting story to be told, but the editor says, go get this guy's story. You're gonna be like the last person to get it right before he goes, so go and try to get it all down right. And he's spending his last few hours recounting the events that would lead up to him being in the cell. A pretty good hook. The mystery's not super big, you know, like you're not spending the whole time trying to figure out who the guy is that's gonna die or anything like that, but it does hook you in, even if it's really not that big of a mystery. But we go into the past, and he says, it all began on the night of those horrible earthquakes, and we see him in his lab hiding under a table, and a giant mound rips through the floor in his laboratory. Again, another case of the Darkside budget, because they show the camera shaking and stuff falling, and you see that there's a mound in his laboratory, but they obviously don't have the budget to have it ripped through the floor, so we just see that it's there, and at first you're like, why is there a big mound in his laboratory? And then he's like, this just appeared, and I'm like, oh, okay, we just didn't have the budget to rip it through the floor. But anyway, he goes up to the mound and he sees it looks like a little volcano, you know, a little tube going down the center, and on top of the volcano there's a series of rings, and if you touch the rings they'll spin and the scene underneath will change. And obviously you don't get too great a look at all these other worlds, but you'll have to take his word for it. This is definitely one of those things that if we had a modern TV budget, they would do a whole bunch of, ooh, look at this, look at that, and you definitely would have seen a lot more here. But anyway, he starts to study this, and he sends stuff in a little pulley system, and he's lowering in thermometers and stuff, and then every now and then a thermometer will freeze, or he'll pull it out and it'll be on fire, you know? So there's some pretty extreme climates here, and he's sending in, you know, hooks and little grabbers and trying to pull stuff out. And he makes a mistake of showing this to one of his friends, kind of a scummy friend. And the friend's looking at some of the stuff he's pulled out, and he's like, this looks to be jewelry. Is it gold? And this is one of the biggest uncut rubies I've ever seen. And he's like, yes, put them down. They're scientific samples. They're important to study. And his friend's like, study? You're a scientist. Why are you doing that? You should be sending in a big grabber, pulling out all the stuff you can, and just sort of exploiting it and trying to make the most profit as possible. And he's like, I'm a scientist, I don't want to do that. But he's like, you really should be trying to make some money out of this. And of course he sends him away. And then he says, I had to do one more probe to finish up my work. And that's kind of one thing that got me. Finish up your work. I was wondering how many worlds were in here, and you think one more probe you're going to be done? I mean, if there's a different new world to explore every time you touch it, I don't see how your work would be finished unless you thought, I'm going too far, for my own safety I should just stop. I don't know. This is again part that I wish we had got to see more of the world on the other side for, but whatever. But anyway, he goes to pull out his last sample, and clinging to the rope, a woman comes out. And the woman's at first panicked. She's running around trying to figure out where the door is, and she's speaking a different language. And he says, calm down, you can't go running around outside acting like that. Let me help you. Now, he says he can't send her back, and I kind of wonder, again, I wish I knew more about what the door was like. Did someone touch it when she went through and that spun it and he can't get it to go back, or does he just not know about sending stuff back? I'm not quite sure why she can't just hop back through the hole, but he says she can't. So he spends time with her and he starts teaching her English. You know, B is for bird, showing her how to write his name, and then he's like, my name's Billy, and she's like, my name is, I think it's Kina or something, and she writes her name down in her language, and it kind of looks like, you know, one of those heart rate monitor things where their writing goes up and down like that. I did find that to be an interesting form of writing, but they start to talk, and it's sort of a case of, you know, at first she's barely getting any of it, but then she advances really rapidly, and he says eventually she's just reading through all of his science books, speaking perfect English, you know, so you do get the sense like, oh man, once she's going here, she really is going, and you do kind of wonder how advanced she is. When they're doing the lessons, you know, B is for bird, they do B is for ball, and he shows her a tennis ball, and she kind of throws it back and forth, and then she catches it, and then it disappears. And then she laughs and it reappears and she throws it at him. A good little example of she knows something. She's got some sort of power, and she starts to allude to the science on her planet being way more advanced, which of course is going to interest a scientist, and then we get more, you know, how the two worlds are different and stuff like that. And overall, it's a nice little budding relationship, but we know something's gonna happen because of the framing mechanism, and we wonder just how this is going to go down terribly, what's going to happen to the girl, and who is going to die, you know? So it is, like I said, sadly, that last bit, a lot of it is off screen, a lot of it is just told to us, so yeah, the final act isn't the strongest, but overall, the stuff with the relationships, the learning about each other's world, you know, it's an interesting, you know, pulpy subject, but yeah, the ending just doesn't play off as the best thing ever, except for the very end. The final visual is fun, but yeah, the ending is a little bit, wish they had a bigger budget, you know? But anyway, overall, a pretty good episode. Not the best thing ever, but a good piece of retro sci-fi pulp. And I definitely would say it's worth watching if you're into that stuff. Actually, have you noticed, the last couple episodes of Darkside have been pretty sci-fi heavy, you know? The Impressionist dealing with a classic sci-fi alien, Life Bomb, a classic what if we did this in the future concept, and now this one, meeting a girl from another planet. We've gotten kind of a sci-fi season so far for Darkside, and I'm kind of wondering how much of that is going to be in the future. Are we just doing all our sci-fi episodes right at the beginning, or is Season 2 going to be the sci-fi season? Have to see what's going to happen. Anyway, to everyone who's watched so far, thank you for watching. To everyone who's liked and subscribed, thank you. You really are helping the channel out. I'll leave a relevant playlist on the bottom. This should be my Tales from the Darkside playlist. If you guys want to see me talk about more Darkside, I've talked about all the past episodes, so that's all of Season 1, the past 2 of Season 2, and I also did the Christmas episodes early, the Joe Hill comic, and a Season 1 overview. So if you want to see me talk about more Darkside, the playlist should be here. Anyway, have a good day. I'll see you guys again very, very soon. Darkside playlist on the bottom. Have a good day now.